March 22nd, 1946. 11:34 p.m., the Hotel Nacional de Cuba, Havana. Meyer Lansky stands on the 8th-floor terrace overlooking the Malecon, watching waves crash against the seawall 100 yards below. He's 43 years old, 5 foot 4 inches tall, wearing a modest gray suit that costs $75, a fraction of what the Cuban officials surrounding him spent on their silk shirts and gold cufflinks. In his hand, a glass of rum he hasn't touched. In his jacket pocket, a cashier's check for $3 million made out to President Ramon Grau San Martin's personal account. Behind him, through the terrace doors, the Hotel Nacional's casino glitters with crystal chandeliers and polished mahogany. Roulette wheels spin, dice roll across green felt, cards shuffle in dealers' practiced hands. American tourists, businessmen from New York, oil executives from Texas, society women from Miami, gamble with the casual confidence of people who believe the house always loses. They don't know the house never loses. They don't know every table, every wheel, every deck has been calibrated to mathematical precision by the quiet man on the terrace. They especially don't know that the president of Cuba is about to become a silent partner in the most lucrative criminal enterprise in the Western Hemisphere. In 6 hours, Meyer Lansky will sign papers that transform a single hotel casino into the foundation of a gambling empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. In 6 hours, he'll shake hands with Cuba's president and effectively purchase a country's sovereignty for the price of a Manhattan penthouse. In 6 hours, the blueprint for Las Vegas, for the Bahamas, for every modern gambling destination will be written in a Havana hotel suite with Cuban rum and American cash. But right now, at 11:34 p.m. on March 22nd, 1946, Meyer Lansky is waiting for the one man who can either make him richer than any gangster in American history or have him shot and dumped in the Caribbean before sunrise. The question isn't whether President Grau will accept the bribe. Everyone in Cuba accepts bribes. The question is whether he understands the partnership Lansky is actually proposing. Not a one-time payment for a casino license, but a permanent alliance that will turn Cuba into a criminal paradise 90 miles from the United States. The terrace door opens. President Ramon Grau San Martin, 62 years old, former revolutionary, current head of state, walks out wearing a white linen suit and a smile that doesn't reach his eyes. He's flanked by 2 bodyguards who stay inside, giving the men privacy. Lansky turns, extends his hand, and in accented but clear Spanish, says the words that will change Cuba forever. "Mr. President, I'd like to discuss our mutual prosperity." 18 months earlier, December 1944, Meyer Lansky had been thinking about Cuba since 1933, when Prohibition ended and the American mob's primary revenue source evaporated overnight. While other gangsters scrambled to replace bootlegging income with narcotics, prostitution, and protection rackets, Lansky looked at the map and saw opportunity 90 miles south of Florida. Cuba had everything: a corrupt government hungry for American dollars, a tourist infrastructure built during the 1920s rum-running days, a geographical position perfect for smuggling operations, and most critically, no effective law enforcement that couldn't be purchased. It was paradise for a man who understood that the future of organized crime wasn't violence, it was business. But 1933 wasn't the right time. Cuba's political situation was too unstable, the American mob too fragmented after Prohibition's end, and Lansky too focused on consolidating power in New York alongside his partner, Lucky Luciano. By 1944, everything had changed. Luciano was in prison, convicted on prostitution charges in 1936. The Commission, the governing body of New York's 5 families that Luciano and Lansky had helped create, was functioning but distracted by World War II's economic disruptions. Law enforcement was focused on wartime security, not peacetime racketeering. And most importantly, American soldiers were coming home with money to spend and a taste for gambling they'd developed in military camps across the Pacific and Europe. Lansky saw the convergence of factors with the same mathematical precision he applied to rigging casino odds. Cuba could become the gambling capital of the Western Hemisphere if someone organized it properly, transformed it from scattered illegal operations into a professional industry. Hotels, casinos, nightclubs, all operating openly with government protection, catering to wealthy Americans who wanted tropical luxury without the legal restrictions of stateside gambling. The model already existed in miniature. The Hotel Nacional, Havana's most prestigious establishment, had operated a small casino since the 1930s, but it was poorly managed, frequently raided by reform-minded officials, and generated minimal profit. Lansky studied it the way a surgeon studies a diseased organ: identify the problem, design the solution, execute with precision. The problem was threefold. First, the casino games were run by amateurs who didn't understand mathematical probability, which meant the house advantage was too low. Second, local operators skimmed excessively, which made the business unsustainable long-term. Third, and most critically, nobody had purchased comprehensive political protection. They bribed individual officials reactively instead of buying the entire government structure proactively. Lansky's solution required capital, connections, and a partner who controlled Cuba's government machinery. He had the first two. Finding the third would require patience, observation, and a willingness to wait for the right opportunity. That opportunity arrived in October 1944, when Ramon Grau San Martin won Cuba's presidential election. The president. Ramon Grau San Martin Grau was a study in contradictions. A physician by training, he'd led Cuba briefly during the revolutionary chaos of 1933, implementing progressive reforms that made him popular with workers and students. When the military forced him out after 127 days, he became a symbol of democratic resistance. His return to power in 1944, elected legitimately, was supposed to mark Cuba's transformation into a modern democracy. Instead, his administration became synonymous with corruption on a scale that shocked even cynical Cuban observers. Within months of taking office, Grau's associates were stealing government funds so blatantly that American diplomats filed reports expressing concern about Cuba's political stability. The president himself maintained plausible deniability, but everyone understood that nothing happened in his government without his knowledge and approval. Meyer Lansky understood something most observers missed. Grau's corruption wasn't a character flaw, it was a business opportunity. A truly corrupt politician was more reliable than an honest one because their interests aligned perfectly with organized crime. Both wanted to make money without interference from law enforcement or reform movements. Both needed to maintain public appearances while operating private schemes. Both benefited from stability over chaos. Lansky made contact through intermediaries in January 1945. Not directly, not crudely, but through the sophisticated network of Cuban politicians, American businessmen, and mob-connected operators he'd been cultivating for years. The message was simple. A New York businessman wanted to invest in Cuban tourism, specifically casino operations, and was prepared to offer terms that would benefit all parties. Grau's response came back through the same channels. He was interested, but details would require a face-to-face meeting. Not in Cuba, too visible, but in Miami, where both men could travel without attracting attention. They met in February 1945 at a mansion in Miami Beach, a property owned by one of Lansky's associates, but registered to a Cuban shipping company. No bodyguards, no witnesses, just two men discussing business in a language both understood. Profit. The proposal. February 1945. Lansky's pitch to President Grau was elegant in its simplicity. He would invest $5 million to transform the Hotel Nacional's casino into a world-class operation. professional dealers trained in Las Vegas techniques, imported equipment, calibrated for optimal house advantage, security systems that prevented both customer and employee theft, and management practices that ensured consistent profit margins. In exchange, Lansky wanted three things. First, a renewable 10-year license to operate the casino without interference from Cuban authorities. Second, exemption from Cuba's gambling taxes, or rather, a private arrangement where Lansky would pay Grau's government directly, bypassing the treasury. Third, and most critically, the right to expand operations to other properties across Cuba if the Hotel Nacional proved successful. The financial terms were straightforward. Grau would receive 30% of net profits, plus a $3 million signing payment, deposited in his personal account. Lansky would handle all operational details, all staffing, all security. The Cuban government's only responsibility was maintaining political protection, ensuring that reform movements, law enforcement, and competing operators didn't interfere with business. Grau asked the obvious question: why Cuba? Lansky could operate in Nevada, where gambling was legal, or in the Bahamas, or dozens of other locations. Why risk investing millions in a country known for political instability? Lansky's answer revealed the depth of his strategic thinking. Nevada was too far from eastern population centers, required too much infrastructure development, and was subject to American legal oversight. The Bahamas were British territory, with uncertain political futures. Cuba offered proximity to Miami, a 90-minute flight, established tourism infrastructure, a population desperate for employment who'd work casino jobs cheaply, and most importantly, a government that could be purchased for the right price. But Lansky's real vision went beyond a single casino. He saw Cuba becoming a criminal-free port, a place where gambling, prostitution, and eventually drug trafficking could operate openly under government protection. American mobsters could invest their illegal profits in legitimate-looking Cuban businesses. Politicians could launder bribes through casino transactions. Wealthy Americans could indulge vices 90 miles from U.S. jurisdiction. The Hotel Nacional was just the beginning. If it succeeded, Lansky would build a dozen more casinos, transform Havana into a tropical Las Vegas, create an industry worth hundreds of millions annually, and Grau, plus whatever political faction he represented, would get 30% of everything, forever. Grau studied Lansky with the calculating gaze of a man who'd spent 30 years navigating Cuban politics. The American gangster was offering him more money than Cuba's entire annual tourism revenue, plus ongoing payments that would make him personally wealthier than any Cuban president in history. The risks: political opposition, American diplomatic pressure, potential revolution, seemed manageable compared to the rewards. They shook hands. The partnership was formed. The details would be finalized in Havana the following year. The preparation. March 1945 to March 1946. Lansky spent the next 12 months transforming the Hotel Nacional's casino from a profitable sideline into a professional gambling operation. He brought in veteran dealers from illegal casinos in New York and New Jersey, men who understood how to control tables, spot cheaters, and maintain the house edge without being obvious about it. He imported roulette wheels and craps tables, manufactured to specifications that gave the house a 5.26% advantage, high enough to guarantee profit, low enough that customers didn't feel cheated. Most importantly, he implemented the skim-proof accounting system he'd developed in New York. Every dollar that entered the casino was tracked through multiple checkpoints. Dealers counted chips under supervisor observation. Supervisors reported to pit bosses who reported to shift managers, who reported to Lansky's personal representative in Havana. At the end of each night, revenue was reconciled against table activity, with discrepancies triggering investigations that usually ended with somebody getting fired or worse. The system was brilliant because it protected everyone. Customers couldn't cheat effectively, Employees couldn't steal without being caught. Cuban officials got their 30% based on accurate numbers, which meant they had incentive to protect the operation. And Lansky, sitting in New York reviewing weekly reports, could track every dollar generated 90 miles away. But the casino renovation was only half the operation. Lansky simultaneously negotiated with Cuba's political machinery to ensure comprehensive protection. He paid off Havana's police chief, the head of Cuba's rural guard, several army colonels, and dozens of local officials whose cooperation was necessary. Each payment was carefully calibrated, enough to guarantee loyalty, not so much that it created resentment or attracted attention. He also cultivated relationships with Cuba's press, paying journalists to write favorable stories about the Hotel Nacional's contribution to Cuban tourism. Articles appeared in Havana newspapers praising the American investment that was creating jobs, attracting wealthy tourists, and modernizing Cuba's entertainment industry. The fact that the investment came from organized crime went unmentioned. By March 1946, everything was ready. The casino had been operating under Lansky's management for 6 months, generating profits that exceeded even optimistic projections. President Grau had received monthly payments that demonstrated Lansky's reliability. The political protection network was functioning perfectly. The time had come to formalize the arrangement with the $3 million payment and the official signing of contracts that would make their partnership permanent. March 22, 1946, midnight to 5:47 a.m. The meeting on the Hotel Nacional Terrace lasted 17 minutes. Grau accepted the cashier's check, examined it briefly, and slipped it into his jacket pocket without comment. Then both men went inside to the presidential suite, where lawyers had prepared documentation that would, on paper, appear to grant a standard casino operating license to a corporation registered in Panama. The real terms, the 30% split, the tax exemptions, the expansion rights, existed in a separate agreement that would never be filed with any government agency. Grau signed both documents. Lansky signed both documents. Witnesses, carefully selected officials who were already on Lansky's payroll, added their signatures. At 1:47 a.m., the deal was complete. Meyer Lansky owned Cuba's most prestigious casino and had the explicit partnership of Cuba's president for whatever expansions came next. But Lansky wasn't finished. At 2 a.m., he convened a second meeting, this one in a suite 3 floors below. Present were representatives of every major American mob family: Frank Costello from New York, Santo Trafficante Jr. from Tampa, Carlos Marcello from New Orleans, and several others. These were the men who'd provided the capital for Lansky's Cuban venture, who'd invested millions based on his vision. Lansky laid out the numbers. The Hotel Nacional Casino was generating $200,000 monthly in pure profit after all expenses and payoffs. Projections suggested they could open 5 more casinos within 2 years, each generating similar returns. Cuba was going to make them all richer than bootlegging ever did, and it was completely legal, at least from Cuba's perspective. The assembled mobsters asked the obvious question: what about the American government? The FBI, the Treasury Department, the politicians who were always looking for headlines by prosecuting organized crime? Lansky's answer was characteristically precise. Cuba was a sovereign nation. American law enforcement had no jurisdiction. Money generated in Cuban casinos could be declared as legitimate foreign income, taxed at standard rates, and invested in legal American businesses. The operation was clean, or at least clean enough that prosecution would be nearly impossible. Santo Trafficante asked about political risk. What happened if Grau lost the next election? What if a reform government took power and shut down the casinos? Lansky smiled, the expression of a man who'd thought through every contingency. They wouldn't just buy Grau, they'd buy the next president, and the one after that. They'd invest so heavily in Cuba's economy that shutting down the casinos would mean economic disaster. They'd employ thousands of Cubans, generating political support that would make closing the operations politically impossible. Most importantly, they'd diversify beyond gambling. Hotels, nightclubs, restaurants, legitimate businesses that made them pillars of Cuban commerce. Within 10 years, Lansky predicted, organized crime wouldn't just control Cuba's underworld, they'd be Cuba's economy. The meeting ended at 5:47 a.m. with unanimous agreement. The American mob was going all in on Cuba. Lansky would coordinate operations, distribute profits fairly among the investing families, and maintain the political relationships necessary to protect everyone's interests. As dawn broke over Havana, Meyer Lansky stood again on the terrace, watching the city wake up. Somewhere below, the casino was closing after another profitable night. Somewhere in the presidential palace, Ramon Grau was probably planning how to spend $3 million. Somewhere in New York, FBI agents were monitoring Lansky's associates, building cases that would never touch the money flowing from Cuba. Lansky had done what seemed impossible. He'd purchased a country, turned corruption into a business model, and created a criminal enterprise that operated openly with government partnership. The quiet Jewish gangster from the Lower East Side had just become the architect of modern organized crime's international expansion. The Empire, 1946 to 1952. The Hotel Nacional was just the beginning. Over the next 6 years, Meyer Lansky and his mob partners transformed Havana into a tropical gambling paradise that attracted hundreds of thousands of American tourists annually. New casinos opened at the Sevilla Biltmore Hotel, the Hotel Capri, and eventually the spectacular Riviera Hotel, a $14 million palace that made Las Vegas properties look modest by comparison. Each operation followed Lansky's model: professional management, mathematical precision in the games, comprehensive political protection purchased at every level of government. The profits were staggering. Conservative estimates suggest the Cuban operations generated $100 million annually by 1952, with Lansky personally controlling approximately 15% of total proceeds. President Grau's administration, meanwhile, became so corrupt that even sympathetic observers expressed concern. But Grau didn't care about his reputation. He cared about the money flowing from Lansky's operations into his personal accounts. When he left office in 1948, he was replaced by Carlos Prio Socarrás, who continued the arrangement with even greater enthusiasm. The partnership between organized crime and Cuba's government appeared unbreakable. American mobsters invested hundreds of millions in Cuban infrastructure. Cuban officials protected those investments with absolute commitment. Tourists gambled in world-class casinos, unaware they were funding the American Mafia's international expansion. Lansky's vision of Cuba as a criminal-free port was succeeding beyond even his optimistic projections. The island became a transshipment point for heroin from Europe to America, a money laundering center for illegal profits from the United States, and a haven where American gangsters could vacation without fear of arrest. The collapse, 1952 to 1959. In March 1952, Fulgencio Batista, a former president and military strongman, launched a coup that overthrew the democratically elected government. Lansky initially worried this would disrupt operations, but Batista proved even more accommodating than Grau. He took a direct partnership stake in several casinos, making him literally a business partner with organized crime. But Batista's dictatorship also sparked opposition that would eventually destroy everything Lansky built. A young revolutionary named Fidel Castro began organizing resistance in Cuba's mountains. What started as a minor insurgency grew into a full-scale revolution as Batista's brutality alienated the Cuban population. Lansky, always the pragmatist, tried to hedge his bets. He made contact with Castro's representatives, offering the same deal he'd given Grau and Batista. "We'll pay. You protect the operations. Castro's response was unequivocal. When the revolution succeeded, every American gangster in Cuba would be expelled or executed, and every casino would be nationalized. On January 1st, 1959, Batista fled Cuba. Castro's revolutionary forces entered Havana. One of their first acts was raiding the Hotel Nacional casino, smashing slot machines, burning roulette tables, and arresting several mob associates who hadn't escaped quickly enough. Meyer Lansky, watching from Miami, saw 13 years of work and hundreds of millions of dollars in investment destroyed in a single day. The Cuban experiment was over. The casinos were closed. The mob associates fled to Miami, Las Vegas, and the Bahamas. The blueprint Lansky had written for international criminal operations survived, but the original model, the partnership with a corrupt government that had seemed so perfect, collapsed completely. The legacy Meyer Lansky died in 1983, having lived long enough to see his Cuban empire reduced to a historical footnote. But his real legacy wasn't the casinos, it was the model. The idea that organized crime could partner with governments, operate openly under legal protection, and transform illegal profits into legitimate-looking businesses revolutionized how criminal organizations functioned. Las Vegas, in many ways, was Cuba without the revolution. When Lansky's associate Bugsy Siegel opened the Flamingo Hotel in 1946, the same year Lansky finalized his Cuban deal, he was applying lessons learned from the Hotel Nacional. Later, Vegas casinos, many backed by mob money, used Lansky's operational systems, his accounting practices, his understanding that gambling was mathematics, not luck. The Bahamas, where Lansky opened casinos in the 1960s after losing Cuba, operated on the same model. Purchase government protection, provide professional gambling operations, attract wealthy tourists. The pattern repeated in Atlantic City, in various Caribbean islands, in emerging gambling markets worldwide. Even the modern legal casino industry, sanitized and corporate, uses principles Lansky pioneered. Optimal house advantage percentages, sophisticated surveillance systems, revenue tracking mechanisms that prevent theft. These weren't invented by legitimate businessmen. They were perfected by a 5'4" Jewish gangster who understood that the real money wasn't in illegal gambling, but in legal gambling protected by corrupt governments. The Hotel Nacional still stands in Havana, operating now as a luxury hotel without a casino. The building where Meyer Lansky met with President Grau, where they signed papers that transformed Cuba into a criminal paradise, is a museum piece from an era when 90 miles seemed like safe distance between crime and consequence. Ramon Grau San Martin died in 1969, his reputation destroyed by corruption scandals, but his bank accounts comfortably full. He never publicly acknowledged his partnership with Lansky, but everyone in Cuba knew. The $3 million he accepted on March 22, 1946, was just the beginning of a relationship that made him wealthy and ultimately contributed to the revolution that destroyed Cuba's democratic institutions. The cashier's check Lansky handed Grau that night, $3 million made out to the president of Cuba, was cashed the next morning at a bank in Havana. The bank, coincidentally, was partially owned by a corporation registered in Panama that ultimately traced back to Meyer Lansky's financial network. Even the bribe was rigged to benefit the man paying it. That's the genius and the tragedy of Meyer Lansky's Cuban empire. Every detail was calculated, every relationship measured, every risk analyzed. He built something unprecedented, a criminal organization operating openly with government partnership, generating hundreds of millions of dollars, immune to American law enforcement. And it all collapsed anyway, destroyed not by the FBI or by rival gangsters, but by a revolution that Lansky's very presence helped create. March 22, 1946, proved that you could buy a president, purchase a country, and build an empire on corruption and mathematics. January 1, 1959, proved that empires built on foreign exploitation eventually face reckoning, that the people you're exploiting eventually notice, and that revolution doesn't care how perfectly you've calculated the odds. Meyer Lansky was the smartest gangster in American history. It wasn't enough.